I've always heard that money doesn't change people, it just reveals who they really are. And that's exactly what happened to me. I built an empire before I was 25, offering luxury, status, security, and a life that few will ever get close to. I turned an ordinary woman into a queen of the elite. But what no one tells you is that when you put someone at the top without them having solid values, the fall is usually ugly. Very ugly. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a story about vanity, choices, and consequences. About how someone can trade a real future for empty promises, fake applause, and a character that lives on appearance. While I multiplied millions in silence, she bet everything on cheap emotion. In the end, well, it wasn't what she expected. Stick with me until the end, because what happened after I discovered the betrayal completely changes the logic of those who think status is more important than loyalty. If you enjoy real, intense stories filled with luxury, power, fall, and an epic comeback, subscribe to the channel now. Here, those who laugh last always teach the greatest lesson. I was only 25 years old when I realized that money was no longer a problem in my life. While many people were still trying to figure out what to do with their careers, I was already running companies that generated millions every month. My name circulated in high-level meetings, international contracts, and rooms where decisions reshaped entire markets. I was young, focused, disciplined, and completely obsessed with growth. Every morning began with numbers, charts, and aggressive goals. The corporate world was my chessboard and I played to win. There was no room for insecurity when real financial power was in your hands. My routine was something most people only see in movies or on social media. I woke up in a modern mansion with glass walls and a view of the entire city beneath my feet. In the garage, luxury cars lined up like silent trophies of what I had built. It wasn't empty show-off, it was the consequence of hard work. Flying first class, closing deals in other countries, dining at Michelin-star restaurants was simply part of my daily life. Money flowed, investments grew, and my confidence kept pace with it all. I believed I had complete control over everything around me. In the business world, I was seen as a prodigy. Too young to have achieved so much, some said. Too cold, others claimed. But the truth was that I simply understood the game. While many wasted energy trying to look rich, I focused on building real wealth. I knew where to invest, when to pull back, and when to move forward. Respect came naturally when you delivered results. And the more money I made, the more doors opened. The financial elite watched me with curiosity and admiration. I didn't come from a wealthy family. Everything I had, I built from scratch. Maybe that's why I valued every achievement so deeply. Every signed contract, every acquired company, every extra zero in my bank account represented sleepless nights and calculated risks. I felt proud of my journey. I felt like I had beaten a system that rarely favors those born without privilege. And that constant sense of victory fueled my confidence. I felt invincible, as if nothing could take me off the top. With success also came social status. Invitations to exclusive events, private parties in luxury penthouses, meetings with influential people. I moved easily among entrepreneurs, investors, and public figures. Everyone wanted to be close to someone who was rising fast. My time became more valuable than money. I chose where to go, who to talk to, which opportunities to accept. It was a seductive world, full of shine and promises. And I believed I knew exactly how to navigate it. Despite all of that, I was still, above all, a simple man when it came to feelings. I believed in loyalty, partnership, and building something together. Maybe it was naivety, maybe it was hope. In the middle of so much luxury and power, I still believed in true love. I thought money didn't change character, it only revealed who a person really was. I felt ready to share everything I had built with someone special. I wanted to build not just companies but a complete life. I believed I had found balance between ambition and heart. I worked hard during the day and dreamed of something deeper at night. I saw my assets as tools, not as an end. The mansion was a home, the cars were means, money was freedom. I never imagined that those same things would become silent weapons against me. At that moment, everything seemed solid, structured, impossible to collapse. The castle stood high and I felt safe inside it. Looking back, I realized that reaching the peak brings a dangerous kind of blindness. When everything goes right, you start to believe it always will. That your choices are flawless. That your judgment of people is perfect. I trusted my ability to control situations too much. I believed financial intelligence was enough to handle any scenario. I didn't consider that emotions can also be a minefield. And that was exactly where the story began to change. I suspected nothing. There were no clear signs, no obvious warnings. My life looked like a script of continuous success. Money kept coming in, businesses thrived, and I moved forward with confidence. Little did I know that while I was building empires, something much closer was being shaped in silence. Something that didn't appear on financial statements or contracts. Something that involved choices, desires, and vanities I couldn't yet see. It was in this scenario of absolute power, constant luxury, and complete confidence that everything began. I didn't know it yet, but the same world that put me at the top would become the stage for the greatest betrayal of my life. And the next chapter wouldn't begin in a boardroom, but much closer to my heart. I met her at a time when my life was already structured, my empire growing, and my mind focused almost exclusively on numbers, contracts, and expansion. She didn't come from my world, didn't frequent boardrooms, and didn't understand the cold logic of million-dollar business deals. Perhaps that was exactly what caught my attention. She seemed fascinated by everything around her, by the city, by the places I frequented, by the security I projected. There was admiration in her gaze, and I interpreted that as genuine love. I felt seen, valued, desired, not just for what I had, but for what I represented. In the beginning, she was simple in demeanor, careful with her words, and curious about my world. She would ask questions about my work, about how I had achieved so much at such a young age, about discipline and ambition. I enjoyed explaining, teaching, and sharing my worldview. I took pleasure in showing her sophisticated restaurants, international trips, and experiences that had once been part of my solitary routine. Seeing the sparkle in her eyes in response to that new world fed my ego silently. I believed I was offering love, opportunity, and growth. Over time, I began to shape her life without even realizing it. Not out of control but out of care, or at least that's how I saw it. I introduced her to stylists, took her to stores where price tags were invisible, swapped simple clothes for designer pieces that matched the environment we now frequented. I wanted her to feel like she belonged in my world, comfortable among businessmen, investors, and the elite. Each transformation was met with compliments from me and smiles from her. That made me feel like a generous man, almost like a builder of destinies. The trips became frequent and luxurious. Paris, Milan, Dubai, exclusive islands few have access to. In each place she seemed to reinvent herself a little more. She learned how to behave at gala dinners, how to converse with influential people, how to walk confidently in environments that once intimidated her. I watched all of this with pride, like someone watching a personal project flourish. To me, it was partnership, it was growth together. I never imagined that this evolution would also awaken something I couldn't control. She began to be admired by everyone around her. She received compliments, glances, and invitations. People commented on how she had changed, how she was more elegant, more confident, more imposing. And I foolishly smiled inside. I thought it reflected well on me, on the man I was, on the provider, the husband, the CEO who builds and shares. I didn't see any danger in external applause. I believed that true love doesn't get shaken by outside attention. This was one of my biggest illusions. As time went on, she ceased being just my wife and became a social figure. Impeccable photos, sophisticated events, high-end environments. I paid for everything without question because money had never been an issue for me. I saw it as an emotional investment, as part of a successful life. While I multiplied businesses, she multiplied her social presence. I believed we were growing together, each in our own way. But the paths were no longer as parallel as I had thought. I took pride in saying I had transformed an ordinary woman into a queen. Not in the literal sense, but in status, in access, in social respect. She had everything she desired: extreme comfort, financial security, total freedom. She didn't need to work, she didn't need to prove anything to anyone. She only needed to be by my side. I believed that this was avoiding suffering, providing stability, offering the best. I never considered that excess can also distort values. That constant luxury can create a thirst for more. She began talking more about status than about feelings. She commented on other rich women, other luxurious lives, other seemingly perfect marriages. She compared, analyzed, observed. I thought these were harmless conversations, a reflection of a new social environment. I didn't realize that little by little her focus shifted from us to image, validation, external admiration. While I was thinking about legacy, she began thinking about visibility. Even so, I kept investing. More trips, more gifts, more comfort. The more I gave, the more I believed I was strengthening our bond. I didn't understand that love doesn't grow in direct proportion to luxury. On the contrary, sometimes it gets lost in excess. I was too busy building empires to notice that emotionally, something was changing right before my eyes. And the next step in this transformation wouldn't take long to reveal itself. It was when the world of the elite opened up completely for her that I stopped being the center of attention. And I still didn't know, but at that moment I stopped being king in my own castle. Something began to move backstage, silently, seductively, and dangerously. And the next chapter would show that not every queen remains loyal when she discovers she can be adored by others. On the outside, our life seemed like a script written to make anyone watching from afar feel envy. Dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, reserved tables under my name, chefs coming personally to greet us, waiters who knew exactly what to serve before we even ordered. The low lights, expensive wines, and privileged view of the city created the feeling that we were living above the common reality. To those who saw pictures or glimpses, we were the perfect couple in the millionaire world. I believed that image reflected the complete truth. Little did I know it hid silent cracks. Private parties became frequent, almost routine. Cinematic mansions, yachts anchored in international waters, sophisticated music, and people who seemed to live in a parallel universe. I arrived confident in an impeccable suit, knowing my presence was respected. She arrived stunning in expensive dresses, jewels sparkling, and a smile trained for that environment. Many eyes turned to us and I felt pride. I thought it reinforced our bond, our position, our shared success. I didn't realize that the attention was beginning to have a different effect on her. The trips became true spectacles of luxury. 5-star hotels, presidential suites, private dinners by the sea, and rides in cars worth more than the homes of many people. Everything was recorded, everything was carefully displayed. I saw it as memories, moments that would stay forever. But for her, I began to notice it was also a showcase. Each destination seemed like another chance to show the world where she was and who she was now. And I, too busy, never questioned it. On social media, our image was flawless. Well-produced photos, carefully calculated angles, captions talking about love, partnership, and gratitude. Friends commented, followers praised, strangers admired. The marriage seemed solid, enviable, unshakable. I believed that external validation was just a natural reflection of what we were living. It never occurred to me that, for some people, appearance could become more important than essence. And the more applause, the greater the hunger for attention. Inside the house, the atmosphere still seemed stable. Calm conversations, plans for the future, comments about new investments and possible country moves. I talked about expansion, legacy, building something lasting. She listened, agreed, but often veered the conversation toward events, invitations, and people we had met. I attributed that to enthusiasm for the new life. I didn't see it as a sign of misalignment. After all, I was used to solving concrete problems, not emotional subtleties. I liked to think I had found the perfect balance between work and personal life. During the day, I ran companies and closed million-dollar contracts. At night, I had a beautiful wife, a comfortable home, and the feeling of stability. To me, that was true success. I didn't feel the need to question anything. When everything seems to be going right, you tend to ignore small disconnections. And that's exactly what I did without realizing the price it would have. There were moments when I noticed a certain anxiety in her, an unease hard to explain. Even surrounded by luxury, she seemed to want more. More invitations, more attention, more recognition. I tried to fill that with gifts, trips, and even more exclusive experiences. I believed that if something was missing, money and comfort would solve it. That was the logic that always worked in business. But relationships don't follow the same rules as financial markets. The fairy tale seemed complete in the eyes of those observing from the outside. No one saw the small changes in behavior, the prolonged silences, the increasingly superficial conversations. I didn't realize because I didn't want to realize. Admitting something was wrong would mean accepting that not everything can be bought or controlled. And I wasn't ready for that idea. I preferred to believe that we were just going through an adaptation phase to extreme success. I kept offering everything within my reach. More comfort, more luxury, more exclusive experiences. I thought it strengthened our connection. Little did I know that while I kept investing more, she began looking outside our golden castle. The external shine started to overshadow what we had built together. And I still believed we were living a happy ending. It was in this scene of apparent perfection that the first poison began to work. Something subtle, almost invisible, that doesn't show up in photos or well-edited videos. A feeling that arises when luxury is no longer enough, and vanity starts speaking louder. And the next chapter would reveal exactly when this began to turn into a real problem. Little by little, I began to notice that something inside her was changing, not in a sudden or obvious way, but like a slow poison spreading silently. It was no longer just about comfort or financial security, because she already had plenty of that with me. It was about being seen, admired, desired by other eyes beyond mine. Small comments started to appear, almost always disguised as jokes. Subtle comparisons with other wealthy couples, other luxurious lives, other successful men. I laughed, ignored it, didn't take it seriously. I thought it was just empty talk, a byproduct of the environment we were now living in. She started observing more than before. She watched other men at events, analyzed their posture, clothes, lifestyles. She commented on who was rising, who was in the spotlight, who had more followers, more exposure. She no longer talked only about real wealth or solid businesses, but about appearance, fame, and social presence. I focused on numbers and results, didn't see it as a threat. To me, wealth was always something built, not displayed. But for her, that distinction was beginning to lose importance. Luxury, which once seemed to satisfy her, began to feel like just a starting point. Expensive gifts no longer had the same impact. International trips stopped feeling special. Exclusive restaurants became routine, not a privilege. The sparkle in her eyes that once appeared with small surprises began to fade. In its place came a constant restlessness, a sense that something was always missing. I confused that with passing boredom, never with deep dissatisfaction. She started talking more about herself and less about us. Her desires, her wants, her social ambitions began to dominate our conversations. Everything revolved around the image she projected to the world. I noticed that she wanted to be more than the CEO's wife. She wanted to be recognized for something of her own, even if it was hollow. And in my naivety, I interpreted that as personal growth. I never imagined that this search for validation could turn into silent contempt for the man who had always been by her side. At times, I noticed a certain disguised disdain. Small ironies, sharp remarks, cold responses. Nothing that could be pointed to as a major problem on its own, but together it started to weigh on me. I wondered if I was working too much, if I was emotionally absent. I thought maybe I needed to invest more time in her, more attention, more gestures. It never crossed my mind that the problem wasn't lack but excess. Excess luxury, excess validation, excess ego being fed. She began to value what others thought more than what I felt. Likes, compliments, and invitations started to dictate her mood. A successful event made her euphoric. An invitation that didn't come left her irritated. I watched this in silence, trying to understand, trying to adjust my routine to please her. I believed love was constant adaptation. I didn't realize I was giving up space while she was emotionally pulling away. The elite environment has its traps, and I underestimated them. People constantly compare everything, competing for attention, status, and recognition. And she dove into that game intensely. Each new external reference seemed to diminish the value of what we already had. I was still the same man, the same provider, the same disciplined CEO. But little by little, it seemed that was no longer enough to impress her. And this silent change began to bother me, even though I couldn't quite explain why. I tried to rationalize everything. I told myself that relationships go through phases, that success can bring challenges, that luxury can temporarily confuse people. I believed that patience, dialogue, and consistency would be enough. After all, I had always solved problems with strategy and persistence. What I didn't understand was that vanity cannot be solved with logic. It grows precisely when it's fed without limits. There were nights when I watched her in silence as she scrolled through her phone, smiling at something I couldn't see. It gave me a strange discomfort, but I ignored it. I chose to trust. I chose to believe everything was under control. After all, I had built an empire from nothing. Why wouldn't I be able to hold a marriage together? That overconfidence was another mistake I only recognized far too late. The first poison of vanity was already taking effect, even if invisibly. I didn't see the betrayal, but I already felt the distance. And the next step in this story would show that when too many doors open for someone who doesn't know what they want, someone always ends up walking through the wrong one. Everything began to change more noticeably when she started frequenting environments where luxury wasn't just a consequence of work, but a constant performance. Ultra-high-end gyms, exclusive clubs, closed events where appearance mattered more than substance. I saw it as harmless, even healthy. After all, she had time, freedom, and access. I didn't see danger in sophisticated social circles because I had always moved through them with focus and discipline. The mistake was assuming everyone enters those environments with the same maturity. Not everyone knows how to separate admiration from temptation. She began meeting people who lived off image, not results. Influencers, models, famous personal trainers, men and women who knew exactly how to attract attention. People who mastered the game of social seduction but had no real assets, no legacy, no responsibility. They spoke loudly, laughed easily, and promised worlds they had never built. I, busy with companies and meetings, wasn't present in those moments. And while I was generating real wealth, others were selling well-packaged illusions. The luxury gym became a new center of her life. It was no longer about health or well-being, but about who was there, who was watching, who was commenting. Clothes became more provocative, schedules more strategic, stories told with excessive enthusiasm. I listened but didn't connect the dots. I thought it was just excitement over a new routine. I didn't realize that environment was feeding exactly the kind of vanity that had already been growing inside her. Exclusive events multiplied. Invitations to launches, private parties, dinners where the glow of cameras seemed more important than the conversations. She prepared herself with excessive care, spent more time choosing outfits, makeup, poses. I funded everything without question because money was never the issue. The problem was what that unlimited access was awakening. The elite can be fertile ground for empty ambition when there are no solid roots. She began coming home different. More silent on some days, more euphoric on others. She mentioned new names, people I didn't know, stories that weren't part of our world. I asked casually but never went deeper. I believed excessive control suffocates and I didn't want to be that kind of man. Trust had always been an important value to me. What I didn't realize was that blind trust can also be dangerous. Constant exposure changed the way she saw herself. She was no longer just my wife, she was someone observed, commented on, desired. And that affected her identity. The more attention she received, the more distant she became from the reality we had built together. Luxury stopped being a shared gift and became an emotional currency. And once again I underestimated the impact of that. I believed our wealth and our history protected us. After all, I offered stability, security, and a concrete future. But in that world, many don't value what is solid. They value what shines quickly even if it fades just as fast. And she began to fall under the spell of that artificial glow. Not because something was missing at home, but because there was an excess of stimulation outside it. There was a clear difference between my world and the world she was beginning to explore. In mine, decisions cost millions and carried real consequences. In hers, words were light, promises were empty, and everything felt like a game. I built companies with a long-term vision. They built narratives to impress in the short term. And she moved between those two universes without realizing the risk that represented. I still tried to justify everything rationally. I told myself she was just adapting, discovering herself, taking advantage of social opportunities. I didn't want to seem insecure, I didn't want to seem controlling. After all, I had always been confident, secure in myself and in what I offered. That confidence, however, began to turn into carelessness. And carelessness, in the wrong environments, usually comes with a high price. It was in this scenario of too many open doors that someone specific began to stand out. A recurring face, a constant presence, someone who seemed to know exactly how to talk to her. I didn't know it yet, but the next chapter would introduce the character who would turn vanity into betrayal. And when that happens, the game changes forever. I don't remember exactly the day I heard his name for the first time, because at that moment I didn't give it the slightest importance. He was just another face from that new social circle she was part of, just another man who lived off image, presence, and well-rehearsed words. One of those who present themselves as successful, but whose real wealth fits inside a social media showcase. He had no companies, no solid businesses, no legacy at all. What he did have was time, a sculpted body, cheap charisma, and an impressive ability to say exactly what people want to hear. He moved through the same environments she did, always smiling, always available, always projecting confidence. On social media he seemed to live a life of constant luxury, even though everything was borrowed, sponsored, or carefully staged. Cars that weren't his, trips paid for by others, expensive clothes returned after the photo. I knew that type of person very well. In the real world of business they don't survive. But in the world of appearances they reign for a while. And it was in that fragile kingdom that he began getting close to her. She spoke about him as if he were something irrelevant, almost invisible. A loose comment, a casual mention, nothing that raised immediate suspicion. I didn't feel threatened because there was no possible comparison between us. I was the man who funded the life she lived, who offered security, a future, and real stability. He was just someone orbiting the environment, a well-trained extra. I underestimated the power someone like that can have when he finds the right vanity to feed. His approach was always the same. Attentive looks, constant compliments, calculated presence. He treated her as if she were unique, special, incomparable. Things I had said before, but coming from someone new, they sounded different. While I talked about plans, companies, and growth, he talked about feelings, appearance, and admiration. He didn't offer a future, he offered emotion. And many times, for someone who already has everything materially, emotion becomes the most valuable currency. Little by little, I realized he was always around. Always mentioned, always present in stories, always involved in situations that seemed too innocent to be coincidences. Workouts that lasted longer, conversations that continued afterward, events where he reappeared with suspicious frequency. I still trusted, I still believed. I didn't want to seem paranoid or insecure. After all, I always believed that respect and loyalty don't need constant surveillance. He presented himself as someone who understood her. He said she was different from the other women in that environment, that she had something special. Those ready-made phrases are dangerous weapons when they meet someone hungry for validation. I wasn't there to hear those conversations. I was too busy building something concrete while he was building fantasies. And fantasies, when well told, can seem more attractive than reality. The most ironic part is that if I had stopped to analyze him coldly, I would have seen the emptiness behind him. There were no plans, no real ambition, no discipline. Just an endless present with no commitment to tomorrow. But in that context, none of that mattered. To her, he represented something new, light, without demands. And without realizing it, I was starting to be seen as the opposite of that. The serious man, busy, too focused. I still believed that the love we had built was strong enough to withstand any distraction. I thought all of that was nothing more than superficial interaction, inevitable social contact. I never imagined that someone so small could take up so much space. That was yet another proof that underestimating secondary characters can be costly. Sometimes, the court jester watches the king long enough to learn where to strike. Meanwhile, my life went on at its usual pace. Meetings, contracts, strategic decisions. I was growing, advancing, expanding. I had no idea that, in parallel, someone was infiltrating a space I considered safe. And when I realized that his name was coming up more often than it should, it was no longer just a detail. It was a sign that something was shifting beyond my control. I still didn't know exactly what was happening, but I began to feel a strange tension in the air. A sense that I was no longer alone in this story. And the next chapter would show that when you ignore small warnings for too long, they turn into evidence that's hard to ignore. It was during this phase that the signs began to appear more clearly, even though I did everything I could to ignore them. Small changes in the way she spoke to me, in her tone of voice, in the patience that once existed and now seemed shorter and shorter. Comments that sounded like jokes but carried a subtle, disguised contempt. I noticed it, but I rationalized it, told myself it was stress, exhaustion, the influence of the social environment. I preferred to believe that rather than accept that something more serious was happening. Love, when misunderstood, can become an excellent anesthetic for reason. She began treating me as someone predictable, almost too obvious to impress. The man who built million-dollar companies before turning 25 started to be seen as ordinary inside his own home. My achievements no longer sparked enthusiasm, my plans sounded repetitive, my concerns were minimized. When I talked about business, she seemed distant. When I talked about the future, she changed the subject. Even so, I insisted on talking, on adjusting, on trying to understand. I believed relationships require continuous effort, even when only one side seems willing. Sarcasm began to appear subtly, almost elegantly. Small jabs about my excessive focus on work, about my seriousness, about my lack of spontaneity. I, who had always been proud of my discipline and strategic vision, started to feel inadequate within my own marriage. And that is dangerous because when you begin to doubt who you are, you open space for concessions you should never make. I tried to change small things, to be more flexible with my schedule, to be more present, even when it cost important business decisions. She began to show impatience when I asked simple questions. Where she was, who she had gone with, why she was late. The answers came short, sometimes defensive, sometimes far too cold. I felt that something was being protected, but I had no proof, only feelings. And feelings, when you love, are easily dismissed as unfounded insecurity. I didn't want to be the suspicious man, the controlling husband, the CEO who doesn't even trust his own wife. I chose to swallow the discomfort and move forward. Our time together decreased without any clear conversation about it. Dinners postponed, last-minute commitments, schedules that no longer aligned. I justified it by saying that everyone needs space, that it was normal in long marriages. But something inside me was starting to be bothered by how easily she pulled away. Before, any free moment was a reason to be together. Now, there always seemed to be something more important. And I kept convincing myself that it meant nothing. She began looking at me differently, as if I were an obstacle to something she wanted but had not yet said out loud. There was coldness where there used to be affection. Distance where there used to be complicity. I tried to rescue moments, create situations, remind us of who we were. But everything seemed to require too much effort, as if I were pulling on something that no longer wanted to be pulled. Even so, I insisted because giving up felt like failure and I had never been the kind of man who gives up. There were moments when I thought about confronting her directly, asking if something was wrong, if she was happy, if she wanted something different. But I always postponed it. Part of me was afraid of the answer. Another part believed that talking too much could create a problem that might not even exist. I chose strategic silence, the same kind that often works in business. But human relationships don't follow corporate logic. In this case, silence only gave space for other voices to be heard. I began to feel that I was being compared, even if indirectly. Comments about people who were lighter, more present, more interesting appeared without names, but with clear intentions. I understood the message but refused to fully accept it. After all, I was the man who paid for everything, who sustained that life of luxury, who offered absolute security. I thought it was impossible to be discarded like that. That belief left me vulnerable. Love made me ignore signs that, in any other context, I would have identified immediately. If it were a contract, I would have ended it. If it were a business, I would have investigated it. But when feelings are involved, even the most rational man can become blind. I believed my consistency would overcome any instability. I didn't realize that while I was insisting on maintaining, someone else had already begun to replace. It was in this scenario of ignored signs and misplaced trust that the next step took shape. Something that could no longer be disguised, something that would move from the realm of intuition into the territory of proof. And the next chapter would show that some truths only surface after they have caused enough damage to make them impossible to undo. The truth began to take shape when I realized that her choices were no longer guided by feelings, but by whatever seemed to elevate her image within that superficial world. What drove her wasn't love, it was status, it was the feeling of being desired, talked about, admired by people who barely knew her essence. She began trading stability for adrenaline, security for instant validation. I still had no proof, but the pattern was far too clear to ignore. When someone starts measuring their value by the gaze of others, any solid commitment becomes too heavy to carry. She became emotionally involved long before admitting anything to herself. Long conversations, hidden messages, laughter that no longer happened with me. I felt a parallel life forming, a universe where I didn't exist. While I talked about growth, companies, and long-term plans, she lived for the now, the impulse, the thrill of being desired by someone who demanded nothing beyond her presence. It was easier to feel special there than to face the depth of a real marriage. The most painful part is that she knew exactly what she was doing. It wasn't naivety, it wasn't confusion. It was a choice. She chose to trade a man who offered a future for someone who offered applause. She chose a relationship built on quicksand simply because it felt more exciting in that moment. I still believed our story carried enough weight to prevent that kind of rupture. I underestimated how loudly the ego can speak when it's constantly being fed. She began justifying the unjustifiable inside her own mind. Small internal lies, convenient rationalizations, unfair comparisons with me. I started being seen as absent, too serious, too predictable. Meanwhile, he was seen as light, fun, spontaneous. The contrast was false, but it felt real to someone who wanted to believe it. And when someone wants to cheat, any narrative works as an excuse. I became the villain in a story I didn't even know was being written. The involvement grew in the shadow of the luxury I provided. Expensive restaurants paid for by me, exclusive environments that only existed because of my money. The irony was cruel. I was financing the stage of my own betrayal without knowing it. While I was closing million-dollar contracts, she was living emotion-filled encounters, supported by a structure he had never built. That, later on, would become impossible to ignore. She began lying with frightening ease. Timelines that didn't add up, vague commitments, poorly told stories. I listened but still resisted the idea that it was real. Part of me refused to accept that someone I had placed at the top of my life could betray me like that. I wanted to believe it was just a phase, a temporary detour. But the frequency of the lies began to reveal something bigger. The lover offered nothing concrete. There were no plans, no stability, no future. Just constant presence, easy compliments, and empty promises. Even so, she let herself be carried away. Because to someone starving for validation, any crumb of attention feels like a feast. And the more involved she became, the farther she drifted from me. The bond that united us was beginning to break, and I couldn't stop it. I began to feel a strange weight inside the house. A tension that didn't need words. Her gaze avoided mine, her gestures were automatic, affection felt rehearsed. I still tried to maintain normalcy, but something had already broken. Betrayal, even before it's discovered, leaves invisible marks. And I was starting to feel them every single day. The worst part wasn't just imagining that she was with another man. It was understanding the reason. It wasn't for love, it wasn't for lack of money, it wasn't because of abandonment. It was for status. It was for the illusion of power, for fed vanity, for the desire to feel above everything and everyone. That hit my pride in a different way. Not as a man but as someone who built everything through real effort. I still didn't have the proof in my hands, but the castle was already cracked. Something inside me was beginning to brace for impact. I felt that I was about to see something that would change everything. And the next chapter would leave no room for doubt, only for harsh decisions I never imagined I would have to make. The day everything came to light didn't begin any differently from the others, and maybe that's why the impact was even greater. I woke up early, reviewed reports, attended strategic meetings, and made decisions involving large sums of money as if it were routine. Nothing indicated that, on that same day, the structure I believed was solid would collapse from the inside. The contrast between the absolute control I had in business and the vulnerability I was about to face in my personal life was brutal. I still believed I was dealing with nothing more than vague suspicions. The first pieces of evidence appeared almost trivially, as if fate wanted to test how long I would deny reality. A notification at an unusual hour, a name repeated too often, a conversation cut short in a hurry. I didn't invade anything, I didn't have to look hard. When the truth wants to surface, it finds its own way. Each detail began to fit together in a painfully logical way. What were once scattered suspicions formed a pattern impossible to ignore. When I finally saw the messages, the ground seemed to fall away beneath my feet. It wasn't just flirting, it wasn't something superficial. There was intimacy, plans, inside codes, promises whispered through written words. Everything she claimed didn't exist was right there, exposed. The lover made it clear he felt like part of her life, as if he had a right to a space that was never his. Betrayal stopped being an abstract idea and became a concrete fact. What shocked me most wasn't just the content of the conversations, but the natural way everything unfolded. There was no explicit guilt, no hesitation. It was as if that parallel relationship was simply another extension of her routine. I felt replaced without warning, discarded while I was still fulfilling the role of provider. The sense of humiliation came instantly, mixed with silent indignation. I didn't yell, I didn't lose control, I just absorbed everything in silence. The images came later. Records of meetings, times, places I knew very well. Restaurants I had taken her to before, environments I financed without a second thought. The weight of the irony was almost unbearable. I realized I was paying, directly or indirectly, for the stage of my own humiliation. This wasn't just emotional betrayal, it was a profound disrespect for the history we had built together. For a few minutes I stood still, trying to understand how I had ended up there. I mentally revisited every ignored sign, every postponed conversation, every discomfort swallowed in the name of love. Everything made sense now, but in a cruel way. The logic that had always guided me in business finally applied to my personal life, far too late. I understood there was no longer room for doubt or justification. The truth was there, complete and definitive. The most painful realization was that she never showed fear of losing me. In the messages, there was no concern about consequences, only enthusiasm for the moment. That struck something deep inside me. It wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of the image I had of her. The woman I had placed on a throne had chosen to bow to someone who offered nothing but empty words. The castle didn't just crack, it revealed it had been built on illusions. I thought about confronting her right then and there, but something held me back. Maybe pride, maybe self-preservation instinct. I needed clarity, not an emotional explosion. I learned early that important decisions shouldn't be made in the peak of anger. I took a deep breath, closed everything, and went back to work as if nothing had happened. On the outside I remained the cold, focused CEO. On the inside, something was silently reorganizing. From that day on, my posture changed. Not because I had lost control, but because I had finally regained lucidity. I was no longer confused, no longer in doubt. The betrayal had eliminated any ambiguity. The love I felt began to give way to something more rational, more strategic. I still didn't know exactly what I would do, but I knew nothing would ever be the same. The game had changed and I needed to play it differently. I still didn't reveal anything, didn't confront her, didn't give any signs. I kept observing, calculating, understanding the full scope of everything. Silence became my greatest weapon. While she believed she was in control, I began planning my exit. And the next chapter would show that my reaction wouldn't be impulsive, but cold, precise, and definitive, just like everything I do when I need to protect what's mine. After the discovery, I went into the mode that has always saved me in the most critical moments of my life: strategic silence. There were no screams, no confrontations, no dramatic scenes. I learned early on that whoever loses control loses advantage. While internally I was reorganizing everything, externally I maintained the same calm, focused, and predictable posture. I kept going to work, closing deals, making decisions involving millions as if nothing had happened. Silence gave me back the control I hadn't realized I had lost. She didn't suspect anything at first. She continued living her routine, her outings, her calculated smiles. I observed every move with a different perspective now, free from illusion. Every word she spoke passed through a new filter, colder and more analytical. I didn't argue, I didn't question, I didn't ask for explanations. I simply recorded everything mentally. That emotional distance was difficult but necessary. I needed to separate the wounded man from the CEO who solves problems with precision. While she distracted herself with the false sense of being in control, I began acting behind the scenes. I consulted lawyers, organized documents, reviewed contracts, and protected my assets with the same seriousness I protect my companies. Every decision was made with extreme care. I knew that an emotional mistake could be costly. The marriage at that point had become a broken contract. And broken contracts require a clean and strategic termination. Curiously, the quieter I became, the more comfortable she seemed. The absence of questions was interpreted as trust or indifference. That only made everything easier. I learned that many times people fully reveal themselves when they believe they are not being watched. And she revealed herself. She continued investing in the affair, unaware that I had already completely changed my position in that game. I began to see everything with an almost frightening clarity. The lover was not a real threat, he was just a symptom. The real problem was the break in values, the lack of loyalty, the conscious choice she made. And that cannot be fixed with conversation or therapy. If someone chooses to betray when they have everything, they will do the same under any circumstances. That realization, as hard as it was, brought a strange sense of peace. I no longer needed to try to fix anything. At work, my performance increased, as if all the repressed emotional energy had been redirected into business. New opportunities emerged, negotiations advanced, investments began to yield faster returns. The external silence hid a productive storm inside. I was focused, determined, and extremely efficient. True power makes no noise. It moves while others are distracted. At home, the emotional distance became more evident. Short conversations, neutral interactions, absence of real intimacy. She seemed confused at times, perhaps sensing that something was different. But she never imagined how much. I showed no anger, no sadness. Just neutrality. And that is often more unsettling than any direct confrontation. I no longer argued because I had already decided. Each silent night reinforced my conviction. I no longer felt the desire to save the relationship, only to end it in the cleanest way possible. Love had been replaced by clarity. I didn't hate her, I didn't seek emotional revenge. I simply no longer saw any point in continuing something that had already been broken by her choice. That kind of decision, once mature, does not go back. I knew the moment of confrontation would still come, but it wouldn't be impulsive. It would be at the right time, when everything was aligned, protected, and under control. I didn't need to rush. Time at that moment was working in my favor. And the longer I waited, the deeper she went into something she wouldn't be able to sustain. The fall would be proportional to misplaced confidence. The silence of true power is not emptiness, it is preparation. While she believed she was living an adventure without consequences, I was already several steps ahead. The end was decided but not yet announced. And the next chapter would show how to end a marriage with the same coldness and efficiency used to terminate a contract that no longer generates value. When I decided to end the marriage, I was no longer carrying anger, only conviction. It wasn't a decision made in a moment of intense pain, but in the silence of many nights of cold analysis. I handled the divorce the same way I handle everything in my life, with strategy, clarity, and absolute preparation. Every detail was planned to protect what I had built through years of disciplined work. Love had failed, but control had not. I would not allow her choice to put my assets, my stability, and my future at risk. The ending had to be clean, definitive, and irreversible. When I finally spoke to her, there were no screams or drama on my side. My voice was calm, firm, almost corporate. I said I knew everything without going into unnecessary details. The shock on her face was immediate. She tried to deny it, minimize it, confuse the situation. But I wasn't there to debate versions, I was there to communicate a decision. I said the marriage was over and that the next steps would be handled legally. That conversation lasted less than many meetings I've had at the company. She tried to appeal to emotion, bringing up memories, promises, justifications. I listened in silence, without interrupting. Not because I believed her, but because I needed to confirm something within myself. Every word she spoke reinforced that the betrayal had not been an isolated mistake, but a conscious choice. There was no true remorse, only fear of losing comfort and status. That sealed any remaining doubt. I knew I was doing the right thing. The legal process was fast and efficient because I had prepared everything before even speaking to her. Experienced lawyers, organized documents, clear agreements. There was no room for surprises. I protected companies, investments, and assets with the same precision I used to protect million-dollar contracts. The marriage ended on paper the same way it ended emotionally. Cold, direct, with no room for interpretation. To me, that wasn't cruelty, it was consequence. She immediately lost access to the life she had been living. Cards blocked, accounts separated, privileges ended. There was no public scandal, but there was impact. The woman who lived like a queen had to face reality without the empire I sustained. I made no effort to humiliate her, I simply withdrew what had never truly been hers. Luxury doesn't sustain itself. And when the source dries up, everything changes quickly. Meanwhile, I dove even deeper into work. New projects emerged, international investments moved forward, companies expanded. It was as if removing an emotional weight had released even more focus. Money began to grow again at speed. I felt like I was reclaiming something that had been slowly drained away. Mental clarity brought almost immediate financial results. The end of the marriage marked the beginning of a new phase of growth. She tried to keep up appearances for a while. She continued attending some events, trying to maintain the image she had built by my side. But without real financial support, everything began to shrink. Invitations decreased, contacts cooled off, doors closed. The elite world is ruthless with those who lose relevance. I observed everything from a distance, without pleasure, without pain. Simply as someone who understands how that system works. The lover, who once seemed so present, began to disappear. Without the luxury I provided, the relationship lost its shine. Empty promises don't pay bills, don't maintain status, don't sustain a routine. I knew that would happen. Relationships based on appearances rarely survive when reality shows up. Even so, I didn't interfere. Everyone needed to deal with their own choices. The divorce didn't destroy me, it redefined me. I realized I had confused generosity with a guarantee of loyalty. That I had given too much without demanding real reciprocity. That understanding was hard but liberating. I no longer saw myself as a victim, but as someone who learned something essential about limits. And once you learn that, you rarely repeat the same mistake. From that moment on, my life followed a different direction. I was stronger, more focused, and more aware of my value. But the story wasn't over yet. Because when luxury ends and loneliness arrives, regret usually comes knocking. And the next chapter would show exactly when she realized the magnitude of the loss she had caused. After the divorce, her fall wasn't immediate. It was gradual, silent, and deeply revealing. At first, she still tried to sustain the image she had built while she was by my side. She kept dressing well, frequenting some familiar places, maintaining the posture of someone who still belonged to the elite. But without the constant flow of money, without the structure I had provided, everything began to feel forced. Luxury, when it isn't supported by a real foundation, becomes nothing more than fragile scenery. And it only took a little time for the cracks to start showing. The invitations began to decrease almost imperceptibly at first. Events that were once guaranteed started requiring confirmation, then stopped coming altogether. The people around her disappeared as easily as they had appeared. The social world is selective and ruthless, especially with those who lose financial relevance. She began to realize that many smiles were self-interested and that the attention she received wasn't about who she was, but about what she represented while she was with me. That realization often hurts more than any material loss. The parties became smaller, less frequent, and far less glamorous. Simpler environments, tighter social circles, less exciting conversations. She tried to maintain a confident posture, but the change was visible to anyone who knew how to observe. The woman who once walked confidently through luxurious settings now seemed out of place. The status that once felt permanent revealed itself to be temporary. And when that happens, the identity of someone who lived only for that begins to collapse. The lover, who once seemed so present and confident, revealed his true nature. Without the money, without the indirect benefits, without the luxurious setting, his interest began to cool quickly. Promises turned into excuses, constant presence turned into absence. She started to realize that she had traded something solid for someone incapable of sustaining any kind of real commitment. The illusion began to dissolve and frustration came with it. She tried to adapt, to find new ways to maintain the lifestyle she had learned to enjoy. But financial reality no longer allowed excess. International trips became memories, expensive restaurants were replaced by ordinary options, impulsive shopping ceased to exist. Each small sacrifice worked as a reminder of what had been lost. And the more she tried to deny it, the more evident the fall became. I observed everything from a distance, without satisfaction and without resentment. I took no pleasure in seeing it, but I also felt no pity. Every consequence was the direct result of a conscious choice. I learned early that decisions shape destinies and she was living hers. Silence once again was my stance. I didn't interfere, I didn't comment, I didn't offer help. Everyone must cross their own desert when they choose to abandon the safe path. Little by little, regret began to surface. Not in a noble way but loaded with frustration and loss. She started to reassess everything, to compare the empty present with the comfortable past. The memory of luxury, respect, and stability returned like a weight. What once felt oppressive now felt like protection. But time doesn't go backward and choices can't be undone with nostalgia alone. She began to isolate herself more. The shine that once followed her gave way to a tired expression, a less confident posture. The world that once applauded her turned its back without ceremony. The false royalty fell without an audience, without broken crowns, simply with the absence of everything that made her feel special. This is the part no one shows on social media. The aftermath when the illusion ends. The hardest realization was that she began to understand the problem was never a lack of love, but a lack of values. She had everything but wanted more validation. She had security but wanted adrenaline. She had a future but chose the present instead. That understanding came too late. And the clearer it became, the heavier the regret she carried alone. I knew that wouldn't be the end of our story. Not because I wanted to revive anything but because when the fall is complete, the urge to return to what was lost usually arises. And I sensed that at some point she would knock on my door. The next chapter would show exactly when that happened and how the game would be definitively reversed. While her life was shrinking, mine was entering a cycle of silent and extremely consistent growth. Without the emotional strain of the marriage, my mind became clearer, more strategic and far more focused. I woke up with clarity, went to sleep with a sense of duty fulfilled, and made decisions with a precision I hadn't felt in a long time. Money started flowing strongly again, not by chance but because I was fully present in every move. New projects emerged almost naturally, drawn to this phase of absolute focus. Silence became fuel. I began investing in an even more aggressive and intelligent way. Expanding companies, international markets, long-term assets that few people could see. While many sought to flaunt success, I worked to multiply it. My name regained strength behind the scenes of high-level corporate circles. Confidential meetings, strategic invitations, partnerships that never appear on social media. This kind of growth makes no noise, but it completely changes the game. I was exactly where I have always belonged, a few steps ahead. My routine became almost surgical. Training in the morning, decisive meetings throughout the day, constant study at night. I wasn't running from anything, I was building something even bigger. Discipline once again became an absolute priority. Every choice was made to generate real impact. Money stopped being just security and became a tool for expansion. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The results spoke for themselves. Over time, new opportunities began to emerge outside the country. Business trips became more frequent, but now with a clear purpose. It wasn't luxury tourism, it was strategy. I analyzed markets, assessed risks, and closed deals that significantly increased my wealth. While some remembered my divorce as a possible setback, I turned it into leverage. What many saw as an ending for me was a restart. I could clearly see the contrast. While I moved forward, she disappeared from the social radar that once celebrated her. The silence around her was almost total. And interestingly, my silence also drew attention. People began to comment that I was different, more centered, more powerful. Not because I displayed anything new, but because confidence had become natural again. True power doesn't need to be announced. My net worth grew consistently. New properties, strategic stakes, companies that began to depend on my decisions. I felt that I had regained absolute control over my life. There were no emotional distractions, no internal conflicts. Everything was aligned with who I had always been. Money once again started working for me, not the other way around. That feeling is hard to explain to those who have never lived it. With growth came a deep internal shift. I stopped feeling betrayed and started feeling free. Free to choose, free to focus, free to grow without carrying someone who didn't value what I offered. Her absence wasn't a void, it was space. Space for expansion, for new ideas, for an even more solid version of myself. I finally understood that some losses are necessary for greater advances. New people began to appear around me, but now I observed everything with far more discernment. I wasn't swayed by appearances, easy compliments, or well-told stories. I analyzed values, attitudes, consistency. What I had lived through made me more attentive and more selective. There was no rush to fill anything. I was complete within my own structure. Any new presence would have to add, never replace something I had built myself. I began to enjoy luxury in a different way. Not as external validation but as a silent consequence of my work. Good restaurants, good hotels, good cars, all without fanfare. I no longer felt the need to share anything. True wealth is being able to live well without having to show it. This financial and emotional maturity placed me on another level. A level few reach because few endure the process. I knew that at some point this growth would reach her ears. The elite world is small and information travels fast. She would hear about the new businesses, the numbers, the achievements. And when that happened, something inevitable would awaken. The next chapter would show how the past tries to return when it realizes it has lost everything that truly mattered. It didn't take long for the silence around her to be broken by the sound of regret. It doesn't arrive in a noble or mature way, it comes loaded with fear, loss, and comparison. I realized something was about to happen when messages started appearing after months of absence. They weren't direct at first, disguised as concern, curiosity, scattered memories of the past. She wanted to know how I was, what I was doing, whether I seemed happy. It wasn't longing, it was a late realization of what she had lost. When she finally appeared in front of me, the image was completely different from the confident woman I once knew. Her eyes no longer held the same security, her posture was withdrawn, the shine was gone. There was nervousness in every gesture, hesitation in every word. She spoke too quickly, like someone trying to fill an uncomfortable silence. I watched quietly, without interrupting, without showing anything. That meeting caused me no pain, only confirmation. She tried to rebuild the narrative as if time could be rewritten. She spoke of confusion, pressure, mistakes, impulsive choices. She said she had never stopped loving me, that she had only lost her way. But as she spoke, all I could see was someone trying to recover what she didn't value when she had it. There was no real accountability, only regret over the consequences. And that makes all the difference. She mentioned how much her life had changed, how everything had become harder, heavier, lonelier. She talked about the absence of comfort, the instability, the frustration of realizing that the promises she had believed in were never fulfilled. I didn't feel pleasure hearing that, but I didn't feel compassion either. It was simply the logical result of consciously made choices. Every word she spoke reinforced that the motivation for her return wasn't love, but the loss of status. At one point, she tried to get physically closer, as if old gestures still held power. I stepped back politely, maintaining distance. There was no anger in my gesture, only boundaries. The self-respect I had rebuilt didn't allow confusion. I was no longer the man who accepted emotional crumbs. The empire I had expanded had also strengthened my inner limits. She tried to remind me of the good moments, the trips, the plans, the life we had. I listened to it all like someone hearing an old story without emotional involvement. That belonged to a past that no longer existed. The man who lived that life was no longer there. I had evolved, learned, and changed. And deep changes do not allow regression. In that moment, I understood that some doors close forever. The request for a second chance came timidly, almost ashamed. It wasn't a firm request, it was a test. She wanted to feel if there was still space, still control, still a possibility. I responded with silence for a few seconds. Sometimes silence says more than any speech. And in that silence, she realized that something had been lost permanently. I said few words, but they were enough. I explained that trust cannot be rebuilt when it is broken by choice. That I carried no hatred, but I also carried no hope of reconciliation. I said I wished her well, but far from me. It wasn't coldness, it was clarity. And clarity often hurts more than impulsive rejection. She cried, begged, insisted. There was no more pride, no more vanity. Just someone facing the weight of her own decision. I remained firm, not out of revenge, but out of self-love. I had learned that going back to someone who discarded you at your peak is to devalue yourself in the present. And that was something I was no longer willing to do. When she finally left, I felt something different from what I once imagined I would feel. It wasn't sadness, nor anger. It was relief. The confirmation that I had followed the right path. The past had knocked on my door and I was strong enough not to open it. But the story still needed a definitive closure. And the next chapter would show who truly laughs last. After that meeting, my life moved forward without any emotional noise. I didn't dwell on the past or celebrate her downfall. I simply moved on, focused on what I have always known how to do best. Build, expand, and command my own path. The empire I had strengthened continued to grow consistently. New contracts, new markets, new numbers emerged naturally. I was exactly where I was meant to be. And that sense of inner alignment is something no amount of money can buy. It can only be earned. I began to see my story from a different perspective. Not as a betrayed man, but as someone who was tested at the peak and chose not to lose himself in the fall. The betrayal didn't diminish me, it simply revealed who was truly by my side and who never was. I understood that giving the world to someone doesn't guarantee loyalty, it demands discernment. That lesson shaped my view of relationships, business, and people. And it became part of my strength. Luxury was still present in my life, but now it had a different meaning. Mansions, expensive cars, international travel, and exclusive experiences were no longer symbols of validation, but of consequence. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Wealth became silent, almost invisible to those outside my circle. And that brought me a peace I had never experienced before. True victory is when you no longer need to be seen. Meanwhile, she remained trapped by her own choice. Not because I wished that upon her, but because time demands payment from everyone. Her regret found no shelter in me, and that was necessary. Some people only learn when they face the definitive absence of what they once despised. I didn't become cruel, just firm. And firmness is often mistaken for coldness by those who have lost control of their own lives. I became a reference again in my field. A young CEO, wealthier, more strategic, and emotionally unshakable. People sought me out to learn, invest, and partner. My name carried real respect, not appearance. And that is something no influencer, no facade character can sustain. The elite world quickly separates those who build from those who merely appear. And I have always been on the right side of that divide. There were moments when I thought about how everything might have been if she had chosen differently. Not with longing, but as an exercise in reflection. The answer always came clearly: I would have had to shrink to fit someone who didn't know how to value greatness. And that would never have worked in the long run. Some relationships don't end due to a lack of love, but due to an excess of incompatible values. Understanding that set me completely free. Today, when I look back, I don't see pain, I see learning. I don't see loss, I see release. The woman I turned into a queen chose to be enchanted by a court jester. And that choice defined completely different destinies. While I continued building a real legacy, she remained trapped in the memory of a luxury that never returned. Time delivered justice without me having to lift a finger. I moved on with my life calmly, without rushing to replace anyone. I learned that well-lived solitude is better than the wrong company. My focus has always been growth, and now I was growing without distractions. The man who emerged from this story was not only financially richer, but far stronger emotionally. And that combination is dangerous in the best possible way. The world doesn't turn on revenge, it turns on consequence. Every choice demands its price at the right moment. I didn't need to humiliate, expose, or attack. It was enough to move forward with dignity and consistency. Silence, once again, was my most powerful response. While some talk about success, others live success for real. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is simple and harsh. Those who abandon loyalty at the peak rarely find stability in the fall. Love without values cannot sustain luxury, power, or a future. I learned that in the hardest way, but also in the most liberating one. And that lesson is worth more than any emotional loss I endured. In the end, the one who truly laughs last is not the one who humiliates, but the one who remains standing when the illusion ends. I moved forward, whole, focused, and more powerful than ever. And she was left only with the memory of the throne she chose to abandon. Maybe, as you were listening to this story, someone came to your mind. Maybe you recognized signs, behaviors, or situations you've lived through or are still living through. How many people today confuse comfort with love, status with value, appearance with character? How many trade what's solid for something that only shines on the outside? The truth is, no one loses when they choose loyalty, discipline, and real growth. But those who abandon these pillars will, sooner or later, face the emptiness they tried to ignore. Luxury without values doesn't last. Power without character doesn't endure. And relationships built on vanity always come with a high price. Now tell me in the comments, do you think betrayal is forgivable when it happens at the peak? Would you go back to someone who discarded you when you were on top? Your answer could help a lot of people going through something similar right now. If this story made you reflect, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and stay with me. Here you'll find intense, real stories full of lessons that money alone can never teach.